General Carlton de Hayes was used to these roads. The stretch of Highway 280 between Albany and America, Georgia, was familiar to him. Dozens of times before, he had driven the winding roads, the long stretches of trees, the occasional rusty gas station with a dusty pump. But today, everything felt different. His car's GPS had just updated its software, and it was starting to malfunction. When he saw a gravel lot next to a faded green sign that said, Ellaville 10 miles, he decided to stop. The sleek military SUV pulled into the open space. General Hayes put the car in park, reached out to touch the screen of his military-grade encrypted phone. The device would automatically disable itself if tampered with. He wore a simple polo shirt and slacks, without any insignia or rank. His insignia jacket was neatly folded, placed in the back seat. He didn't think he'd need it. Just 2 minutes. Just 2 minutes to get his bearings. But then the crunch of gravel behind him made him look up. A patrol car had pulled up, its lights flashing though no siren. It looked old, the words, Lee County Sheriff, faintly written on the side. The door opened, and a female officer stepped out. She was tall, her blonde hair pulled back in a bun, her aviator sunglasses covering most of her eyes. Her right hand rested loosely on the pistol at her side, a stance that was both professional and menacing. She didn't approach immediately, nor did she move warily, but she was clearly assessing the situation. "Good afternoon," she said, her voice unfriendly. "Let me see your license and registration, sir." She walked straight to the window and tapped hard on the glass. Tap. 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 General Hayes rolled down the window, keeping his cool. "Good afternoon, officer. Is there a problem?" Her eyes scanned the interior of the car, then turned back to him. "What are you doing here?" Hayes looked at her for a second, as if assessing whether she recognized him. But she gave no indication that she knew who he was. In that moment, he understood. She saw a black man, dressed in casual clothes, parked on the side of the road, and that was enough for her to feel the need to intervene. Without haste, he reached into the back seat, where a jacket with a military insignia lay neatly. As he lifted it, the officer's eyes changed, a brief flash of surprise, but Hayes was used to these kinds of reactions. He shook the jacket slowly, exposing the insignia. "I'm on my way to Fort Benning. I'm General Carlton de Hayes, the Pentagon's top officer. And may I ask, officer, if I've violated anything?" A heavy silence filled the air. The policewoman stood up straighter, her hand unconsciously leaving her gun. She opened her mouth as if to say something, then closed it again. Her eyes were slightly bewildered. Because at this moment, she knew she had made a mistake. And the consequences were coming closer than she thought. She stopped abruptly, the GPS screen reflected in her narrowed eyes. She glanced in the rearview mirror, assessing Carlton before firing off a cold question. "Where are you going?" The name on her badge read Wilburn. The tone wasn't exploratory, it was direct. Carlton kept his composure, despite the obvious pressure. "I'm just correcting the route." Wilburn headed toward the car, saying nothing, just taking a step back and unholstering his gun. "Get out. I need to check the GPS. You're on private property. This area is notorious for illegal dumping. You fit the profile." Carlton glanced around the deserted corner. He was used to the scrutiny, in Iraq, in Bosnia, even in the conference rooms of Washington, D.C. But this wasn't protocol. He exhaled, slowly. "I'll get out. But clearly, I've done nothing wrong. You're not cooperating." Carlton raised an eyebrow. "I'm following your every request." Wilburn led him to the back of the car. There was no backup car, no body camera. Her radio crackled, but she made it clear. "Hands on the muffler." Carlton hesitated. "Ma'am, I'm a federal officer. My papers are in the car." Hands. On. The muffler. She grabbed his wrist, spun him so hard that his palm hit the hot metal. She kicked his legs wide. He didn't resist, didn't raise his voice. But his tone was quiet. "You're making a mistake." She didn't respond. Up the road, a pickup truck drove slowly by. The woman in the passenger seat rolled down her window, holding up her phone. The teenage boy in the back seat was filming, too. But no one said anything. There was murder in the air. Something was wrong. It wasn't just the situation. It was the way it was happening. The way the silence lingered longer than it should have, the way Wilburn stood there, one hand near the gun, her eyes sharp but restless. She wasn't just on a mission. She was looking for something. A sign. A reason. Carlton didn't move. He kept his hand on the tree trunk, feeling the rough bark under his fingertips. A crutch in the maelstrom of the situation. His eyes scanned the space between them, the teenager with his phone still recording, the older man standing beside him, his arms crossed over his chest. No words were spoken, but the air was thick with tension. "I won't do it again," Wilburn barked. More of a command than a warning. "You are under arrest." Carlton looked at her, not angry, not frightened, just the calm of someone accustomed to dealing with dangerous situations. "I respectfully request that you call your supervisor. Or at least allow me to retrieve my papers from the car. You have no right to demand this now." She snapped, but something in her voice, a hesitation, a moment of hesitation, was gone in an instant. Carlton remained still. "I'm not resisting." This time, his voice was slower, more forceful. "But I need to verify my identity. I'm Lieutenant General Carlton Hayes. My papers are in my briefcase, in the car." Wilburn sneered. It was short, sharp, and sharp. "You expect me to believe that?" He tilted his head, his gaze unwavering. "You don't have to believe it. Just check." But she didn't. Instead, she took a step back, her hand on the radio, her voice quiet but still sharp in the night. The words were carefully chosen, each syllable hitting the nerve of the situation, suspicious subject. Possibly armed. Carlton turned his head slowly, his composure wavering for the first time during this confrontation. "I'm not carrying a weapon." Wilburn narrowed his eyes. "Military, right? Your men are usually armed." Carlton blinked slowly. A long sigh passed his lips. "What are you looking for, officer?" She didn't answer. She wasn't looking at him anymore. She was focused on the radio, a request sent out, a signal for reinforcements. The wind blew through the trees. No one spoke. But Carlton knew, something was about to change. Years of training had taught Carlton that the quickest way to temper pride was to let it crumble under its own weight. But today, he wasn't sure if that lesson still held. He glanced past her toward the truck, where the man in the driver's seat had shifted his stance. At first, he had seemed a passive observer, but now his expression was harder to read, a sign of consideration, or perhaps wariness. The onlookers seemed to have lost their initial curiosity. Instead, they were starting to feel uneasy, as if Carlton were escalating something unnecessarily. But he had no choice. "You're not telling me how to do my job," Carlton said softly. "I'm asking you to follow the rules." She took a step closer. "Are you threatening me?" Her voice was hard, but there was a slight waver in her gaze. Carlton's eyes narrowed slightly. "No, ma'am. I'm just advising you." Wilburn's lips curled up for a brief moment, as if she thought it was cute. But then, without hesitation, she reached into her back pocket and pulled his wallet out, flipping through the papers inside. She glanced at each card without really reading it, until her eyes landed on something. Behind the department ID, a security card appeared, Level 4, issued by the Pentagon. She was silent for a moment. Carlton could see her jaw moving, as if she were trying to swallow something. Finally, she muttered, "Where did you get this?" Carlton replied, his voice calm but heavy with age. "I earned it after more than 30 years of service." She closed the wallet, stepping back a little, but not far enough to admit her mistake. Not far enough to be detected as faltering. "You could have just said so from the start," she said, but her face was red, and not from the harsh afternoon sun. Carlton didn't reply, just looked at her for a long moment. Then he shrugged. "You still can't park here," she said, as if trying to hold on to something to keep her ground. He let out a soft laugh. "I didn't park. I got pulled over. I'm adjusting my route." She turned away, her eyes flickering to her patrol car, as if calculating how it all looked, what the footage might and might not show. "You'll have to wait here until the deputy responds." Her tone was softer, but there was still a wariness. "But when he gets here?" Carlton interrupted. "I want to make a phone call." She turned back, her eyes narrowing suspiciously. "You're calling your lawyer?" Carlton shook his head. "No. I'll call the Department of Defense." She stood still, her lips pressed together. A light breeze blew by, but neither of them moved. Now the real battle was about to begin. She stared at him, waiting for a smile, a joke. But there was none. Nothing but silence, a silence that made her heart clench. She opened her mouth, to say something, but no sound came. In the distance, a faint siren sounded. Another unit finally responded. But it would take them at least 10 minutes to get here. And in those 10 minutes, everything would change. Because this was not a quiet story. Hidden under the veneer of normalcy, everything had been simmering for too long. The sirens were closer now, echoing through the trees. But Officer Wilburn didn't wait. Her hand tightened on the controller, then loosened, as if she herself wasn't sure what to do next. She knew Carlton could see it. The way she walked, the way she glanced over her shoulder at the group of people clustered near the edge of the road, their eyes sharp, alert. The 3 cars had stopped. No one spoke. Just phones raised, recording the moment. She was no longer thinking like a cop. She was reacting like a cornered animal. She turned, her voice sharp. "Don't move." Carlton didn't move. His eyes simply held hers, as if he had known this. "I've already introduced myself," he said, his voice calm. "You're still interfering with a legitimate investigation." "I'm not interfering. I'm just standing here, unarmed, and cooperating." She reached out, grabbed his wrist, and twisted. He didn't struggle. He clenched his jaw, but he didn't resist. It wasn't necessary. But it didn't matter anymore. She pulled his hands behind his back, tightening the handcuffs. The cold metal cut into skin. A gasp echoed from the side of the road. The boy stepped forward, whispering something to his father. The man didn't answer, just quietly raised his phone higher, to record it all. Carlton spoke, his voice soft, not a threat, just a matter of fact. "You knew this was going to blow up, didn't you?" "It always did. Sooner or later." She pushed him forward, toward her patrol car. The gravel beneath her feet shifted. Carlton didn't stumble. He didn't fight back. But she was rough. And he felt it. Not just in her firm grip, but in her voice, so fragile she didn't even recognize it. She opened the back door and pushed him in. She didn't say a word, no Miranda rights, no explanation. Tension filled the cramped space of the cruiser. "You're going to regret this." The calm, deep voice rose from the man in the back seat. He didn't move, but his voice held a terrifying steadiness. Southern accent. Couldn't have been more than 45. Wilburn looked at him in the rearview mirror, pursed his lips. "Mind your own business, man." I'm the one saying this is my business now. Wilbon slammed the door shut and lunged forward. She leaned down, fidgeting with the radio, but her voice was shaky. Carlton sat in the back, his hands cuffed, breathing slowly through his nose. He focused on the seconds. 1, 2, 3. Slowly. Evenly. Who was Wilbon trying to impress? The boy adjusted the camera, set up the screen. But Carlton knew who was really confused. He could hear the panic in her voice, though she tried to keep her cool as she addressed the response unit. She hadn't checked the credentials, hadn't verified her Pentagon phone number. She hadn't even seen the little seal sewn into the corner of his jacket. The one that should have said it all. But someone else had. The teen adjusted the camera on his phone, zoomed in on the patch that said, United States Army. You got it, he muttered. Dad? Yes. Badges. Stars. All. A second siren sounded. Carlton looked out the window. 2 more cruisers had stopped behind Wilbon's car. One was from the sheriff's office. The other was from the state patrol. Deputy Lamar Boyd got out. The man was tall, with a salt and pepper beard, and a heavy bearing. He did not draw his weapon. He did not hurry. He walked slowly toward Wilbon, standing in the middle of the road. His arms were crossed over his chest. Carlton couldn't hear their conversation, but Wilbon's hands were in the air, the gesture sharp and forceful as if to emphasize something. Boyd tilted his head, his eyes glancing over the cruiser before settling on Carlton. He stepped forward, slowly but firmly, and opened the rear door. Sir, I need to ask your name. Carlton looked up, his eyes calm but heavy. Lieutenant General Carlton Hayes, United States Army. Boyd blinked, a moment of hesitation crossing his face. Has she seen your ID? Wilbon asked, his voice low. Boyd looked at the ID in his hand, nodded, and closed the door without saying anything more. He turned to Wilbon, and they moved aside, their conversation now lowered, the tension palpable. Wilbon's stance shifted to a stiff, defensive stance. Boyd glanced at the crowd around him and then back at Carlton. A few seconds later, he opened the door again. Sir, he asked if there was anyone you wanted to call. Carlton nodded, his eyes still calm. Yes, someone. Without hesitation, Boyd reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and handed it to him. This was no longer about making amends, but about accountability. Carlton, despite his handcuffs, held the phone awkwardly. The handcuffs didn't make it easy, but his fingers were steady. He knew the number by heart. There were only 3 people in the entire Department of Defense he had ever called directly, and this was one of them. The phone rang once. Twice. Then a familiar voice said, Major Kendall speaking. Carlton didn't hesitate. This is General Carlton Hayes. I am being held by local law enforcement in Schley County, Georgia. I am in the back of the cruiser. I need verification sent immediately. There was a brief pause, then the voice on the other end sharpened. General Hayes, are you safe at this time? Carlton squeezed the phone in his hand. I need them to verify my ID and information. There are multiple witnesses who recorded this officer not following protocol from the start. A heavy breath came from the other end of the line. Then, like an order. Roger. I will take care of it immediately. I was worried this might escalate. Uncertainty crept into my thoughts as I gripped the phone in my hand. Stay in touch. I'm alerting the Pentagon. My voice was hoarse, almost swallowed by the tension. On the other end, the tone changed. There was a small click, then another voice, calm but authoritative. This is Commander Reeves, sir. We're tracking your coordinates. I've pulled up your military license plate. Local authorities will be in touch with us in less than 10 minutes. Carlton sighed, trying to contain his rising tension. Thank you, sir. Hang in there, and thank you for staying calm. He ended the call, handing the phone back to Deputy Boyd. Through the open door, Boyd glanced at Wilburn, who was still hovering near the car, her eyes restless. She didn't come any closer, but there was something about the way she stood, the way her eyes kept darting from the screen of her phone to the man sitting silently in the back seat, that made the air feel suffocating. 5 minutes passed. It felt like hours. Then, the sound of new tires on gravel. But these were no ordinary patrol cars. 3 black SUVs, unmarked but unmistakable. Windows darker than the legal limit, the kind that moved as if they had priority wherever they went. They stopped right in front of the police line, a second one right behind Wilburn's patrol car. The doors opened in a perfect sequence, with a chilling precision. 2 men in dark suits, their earpieces nearly invisible. Another, in full uniform, stepped out of the lead car. Colonel Errol Gaines. A name familiar in military circles, one Wilburn had probably never heard of. He walked straight past Boyd, past Wilburn, without hesitation, and opened the back door himself. "Mr. Carlton." His voice was calm, but there was tension underneath. "Are you okay?" Carlton nodded, his voice tired but firm. "Good. Just a bruised ego." Gaines nodded, his sharp gaze sweeping the area. "We'll take it from here." Then he turned to Boyd. "Who's in charge here?" Boyd raised his hand, but his face showed his displeasure. He was not happy about this. "I stood there for 10 minutes, waiting, while the tension in the air grew thicker." The officer signaled Wilbur to stop. Gaines stepped forward, her sharp gaze sweeping over Wilburn, who was finally stiff, trying to regain her composure. She took a deep breath, but couldn't hide the tremor in her eyes. "Do you know who that man was?" he asked bluntly, his voice uncompromising. She squared her shoulders, as if to retain some dignity. "He wouldn't produce proper identification until we had him in handcuffs." Gaines frowned. "You acted on your suspicions," he refused to comply. "But do you know who he was? What his title was?" Wilburn pursed her lips, her voice growing heavy, as if each word was being dragged down by the weight of the situation. "He's a 3-star general. And he's locked in a car." The air seemed to go still for a moment. Wilburn tried to continue, but her voice was weak. Gaines crossed her arms, her gaze cold. "I suggest you say no more. This will be reported to your department, your sheriff, and the state attorney general." Wilbur opened his mouth to say something, then closed it. No sound came out. Deputy Boyd stepped aside quietly, raised his hand to the radio, and asked the dispatcher to call the county sheriff. He didn't look at Wilburn. There was no need. The atmosphere said it all. Carlton stepped out of the patrol car alone. His wrists were red, the skin slightly torn from the pressure of the handcuffs. But he didn't complain, didn't even rub them. His gaze was calm, not resigned, but self-possessed. The onlookers had moved closer, silent, unsure of what would happen next. "Colonel," Gaines said. "Do you want to press charges?" Carlton looked at Wilburn. A long moment passed. Behind her, the crowd grew larger. Phones were still recording, the live stream continued. His voice was steady as he answered. "I want her held accountable through the proper channels. The public needs to see that. Because there are lessons that don't need to be shouted, just witnessed." The words echoed in the tense air. Word spread quickly, first in whispers among bystanders, then on social media, in raw but honest videos. And the truth, like an undercurrent, was slowly washing away the lies. The sun had begun to sink low in the sky, the sunset tinting everything orange. A light wind blew across the clearing, carrying the chill of late afternoon. Officer Wilburn stood beside her cruiser, her arms folded so tightly that her knuckles were pale. She said nothing, nor looked at anyone, but everyone could sense the change. She had once been the embodiment of authority, but now that power was a silent void collapsing inside her. The badge on her chest, once a symbol of law and order, was now a piece of metal that reflected the scrutinizing eyes of those around her. She sensed suspicion, even contempt, in the air, a feeling she had never encountered before. The truck of Schley County Sheriff Roger Nix rolled slowly after 10 minutes. A trail of dust trailed behind the wheels as if to signal something ominous. The headlights were off. He was an older man, in his late 60s, tall with broad shoulders and a noticeable limp. But instead of getting out, he just sat there, watching. The scene before him was nothing more than a still picture: the federal SUVs, the silent police, the tall general in front of the black sedan. When he finally opened the door and stepped out, the silence was absolute. Even the birds seemed to have stopped singing. "Someone want to tell me what the hell is going on here?" His voice wasn't a shout, but the voice of a man accustomed to being the loudest person in the room, but now no longer needed to speak to be heard. No one answered right away. No one wanted to be the first to break the tension. Colonel Gaines stepped forward. "Sheriff Nix. I'm Colonel Errol Gaines with the Army Division. One of your officers has arrested a general without due process." Nix silently shifted his gaze from Gaines to Carlton, then to Wilburn. Discomfort was evident in his eyes as he stopped in front of her. "Tracy." Wilburn swallowed. "Yes." Her voice was hesitant. He refused to comply. His vehicle was suspicious. "I followed departmental procedures." "Did you run his badge?" Wilburn pursed his lips. "No." "Did you check the ID he gave me?" "I don't think it was real." Sheriff Nix turned his head, repeating her words slowly, as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing. "You don't think it's true?" "Tracy, this man could have sent you away with a phone call. And he didn't even have to do it himself. What does that tell you?" Wilburn's face flushed, but she remained silent. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest. This was no longer a moment for excuses. She had made a mistake. Chief Nix said nothing more. He simply walked toward Carlton, offering his hand to General Hayes. In the twilight, the handshake was more than a diplomatic gesture, it was a judgment. Wilburn exhaled, slow and deep. For the first time in years, she felt small. Carlton took a deep breath, his eyes fixed on Wilburn, but there was no anger in them, just a heavy weariness. He nodded slightly, his voice warm but no less stern. "I apologize for what happened on the freeway. I don't have the words to express my disappointment." The sheriff stood still, his sharp eyes glancing at the crowd behind Carlton. There was no excitement in his face, only thoughtfulness. "I understand. But what happened next is no longer your concern. It's about her actions when she thought no one important was watching." Wilburn stood still. She knew what was waiting for her. The eyes around her were like hundreds of invisible knives cutting into her pride. She swallowed the lump in her throat, but said nothing. The sheriff continued. "A lot of people saw it. I have a feeling Colonel Gaines would agree and file a formal complaint through DOJ channels. Your behavior was not only reckless, it was illegal." Wilburn blinked, her hands clenching into fists at her sides. She wanted to argue, to defend herself, but the phone was still pointed at her, the lens cold as an irrefutable witness. Silence was the only answer she could give. "Nick Tracy." The sheriff turned to the officer. "You will be suspended immediately. Turn in your badge and gun." A moment of silence. Wilburn blinked repeatedly, as if hoping the words were a hallucination. But they weren't. Everyone was still looking at her, waiting. "Chief," she said quietly, but the sentence was unfinished. "This is not a request." Her hands trembled as she moved to her badge, then to her belt to remove her gun. When she placed both in Nick's hands, the officer didn't even look at her. He turned to face the crowd, holding her badge like a heavy burden. We'll let the investigators figure this out, but I want to make one thing clear. His voice rang out, clear and unquestionable. This is not how we treat people in this country. I don't care who you are, no one deserves what I saw on that video. A teenager stepped forward, holding his phone. Sir, would you like me to send you a copy? Carlton looked at the boy, a small smile flickering across his tired face. Thanks, son. Thanks for filming. The teenager nodded, looking proud but saying nothing. Carlton walked back to his car, opened the door, and grabbed his jacket that had been sitting on the back seat. He put it on, adjusting his collar. The stars above his shoulders twinkled softly in the fading light. A bitter feeling crept into his heart, but he knew what had to be done had been done. Wilburn turned and walked toward her patrol car. She didn't drive away right away. It felt like a door had slammed in her face. Deputy Boyd followed quietly, but no one spoke. The night slowly fell, leaving behind the echoes of an unforgettable day. Taking the keys from her, he knew she wasn't going anywhere, at least not until she answered the question. This was no longer a traffic stop, it was a statement. An assertion that couldn't be ignored. The next morning, the footage was on national news. What had started as a 30-second clip, uploaded by a teenager named Miles Reardon, had become a 2-minute, edited video that had been viewed more than 2 million times in less than 12 hours. The hashtags were unabashed, hashtag General Hayes chopped, hashtag Schley County chopped, hashtag on car reporting. Cameras lined the shoulder of Highway 280, and by noon, their satellites were pointed skyward, as if this were a crime scene. Except no crime had been committed, at least not by the man in handcuffs. General Hayes had quietly left the night before, choosing not to speak publicly. No press conference. No interviews. No angry statements. Just a quick call to his wife, followed by a long, silent drive back to Fort Benning. He had never raised his voice, never called for protests, but that was what made the story resonate. The sheriff's office issued a blank, sanitized statement, stripped of all meaning. We are aware of an incident involving Officer Tracy Wilborn and an unidentified driver. The incident is under internal investigation. They ignored the fact that the unidentified driver had more years of command experience than the entire department combined. But everyone knew. On the second day, protests began to form outside the sheriff's office. Not thousands, but enough to rattle the windows. Enough to be heard on every local radio station across Georgia. Veterans stood at the front of the line, holding photographs. Hayes in uniform. Hayes on the battlefield. Hayes at the White House, receiving a presidential medal. The weight of it weighed on every name attached to the story. Reporters began to flip through files. Analysts began to ask questions. And then, though no one spoke, it became clear, this was more than a traffic stop. This was an indictment of the system. Wilburn's previous complaints, 3 formal ones in the past 2 years, had been quietly dismissed. 2 involved black drivers, another involved a single mother who said Wilburn followed her home and chastised her for misbehaving. The protests, once drowned out by silence, now roared back. Wilburn remained silent. Her attorney offered only a blanket denial. My client acted in accordance with her training and did not violate any established procedures. But no training can justify what the public witnessed. No procedures can explain the act of handcuffing a man without cause. When the case was escalated to the federal level, General Hayes remained silent. He did not seek interviews, did not make a public statement. He spoke only once, at a veterans forum in Columbus, Georgia, 3 days after the incident. His words were not even reported in the press, but someone in the crowd recorded the moment. On the simple wooden platform of the church hall, in his crisp military uniform, he stood, his arms crossed over his chest. His voice was quiet but heavy. I have faced hostility in foreign lands. I have worked under people who did not want me in the room. But I have never felt as small as I did on that Georgia street. He paused for a beat, his eyes scanning the silent room. Then he continued, his voice firmer. But I will not carry anger. That is not what this country needs. What we need is accountability. And more importantly, honesty. We cannot fix what we pretend does not exist. The room did not burst into applause. No one cheered or shouted. There was only a profound silence, a muted acknowledgement, heavier than any cheer. 2 days later, Sheriff Roger Nix announced the results of the internal investigation. Tracy Wilburn was fired. The reason? Excessive force, failure to follow procedures, and abuse of authority. There was no statement from Wilburn. No apology. Just the cold news and the indelible memories of those who had witnessed it all. Behind the closed door, Nick looked around the room, where averted eyes met. No one wanted to talk, but everyone knew. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and firm. She was caught. We all know it. And no matter how much we try to hide it or justify it, the truth remains, it's a shame for all of us. No one objected. They had heard the rumors, seen the undeniable evidence. Her firing didn't silence the noise, but it did change something. It forced people to look at what they had been ignoring. Schools began holding discussions about respect and authority. Local newspapers wrote not just about racism but about blind conformity. They questioned not just the individual but the system that had allowed it to go on for so long. The Riordan's, who had written it all down, were invited to Washington to receive recognition for their bravery, just like Carlton Hayes had. But when he returned to Fort Benning, his life had not changed. He continued his work, but the next time he stood before the cadets, he said something different. You wear this uniform with pride, but never forget that some people will see only what they want to see. Don't let that stop you from standing your ground. Because sometimes, justice is not loud. It's quiet, steady, and never forgets. 3 weeks later, the dust had settled, but the story had not faded. It echoed in college classrooms, in small-town barbershops, in Sunday sermons. People were not just talking about what happened, they were asking, why does it keep happening? How could a man serve his country for more than 30 years, command thousands of men into battle, and still be seen as a threat because of something someone thought they saw? General Hayes was never a victim, it wasn't in his nature. But he didn't pretend it hadn't happened, either. He believed in transparency, dignity, and restraint. He declined the bombastic television interviews, but he accepted an invitation to speak at a leadership conference in Tallahassee. The room wasn't filled with generals or reporters. It was filled with teachers, first responders, high school students, regular people. He stepped up to the microphone, wearing a simple suit, no medals, no stars. Today, I want to talk about restraint. And everyone fell silent to listen. When you are wronged, when you are humiliated, your instinct is to want to fight back. It is a natural reaction, a call to anger. But the real power lies not in the punch you can throw, but in the decision not to. He used to be silent, passive, swallowing all his resentment. But that day, he chose not to be silent. Not with an outburst, but with conscious control. When someone asked, "How did you stay so calm that day?" he just smiled, softly but firmly, "Because my life is not just about that moment, but everything that came before it." He was angry, of course. But he did not let the anger control him. "I don't carry it, I use it," he said. Anger, when you carry it, is draining. But if you use it, it makes you wiser, stronger, and you know when to speak up. That choice changed not just a moment, but the system. Schley County was no longer the same. A new training requirement was imposed on all officers, not just on policy but on awareness. They were to learn about implicit bias, not as punishment, but as correction. Chief Nix, imperfect as he was, decided to bring in independent consultants, people who had never worn a badge but had lived through injustice. Community discussions were held, not easy but necessary. And Tracy Wilborn? She disappeared from the headlines. Left the county, took a job in private security. No badge, no gun, just a uniform with her name embroidered on the chest. The change did not come in a flash. It comes from patient choices, from people choosing to use power properly. The Riordans returned home from the events, trying to find some semblance of normalcy. They ate dinner together, and the conversation continued to revolve around work, school, and future plans. But something had changed. No one said it, but everyone felt it. The teenager with the camera who had captured that pivotal moment continued his journey. He started a YouTube channel, interviewing veteran teachers, neighbors, and anyone with a story to tell about integrity and justice. His first video was titled, "I don't know who he is, but I know what's wrong." In its first week, it had 500,000 views. The comments flooded in, "This is what we need. Justice doesn't just come from tall buildings, it comes from people." Carlton watched the video from his office one quiet evening. When it was over, he turned off the screen, stood up, and walked outside. The cool night air was gently blowing, the sky still tinged with the pink and orange of sunset. He felt neither pride nor vindication. He was just certain that his calmness had made a difference. In the end, it wasn't the badges on his shoulders that exposed the injustice, but how he handled the slight. It wasn't a press conference or a stirring speech, but restraint, dignity that left its mark. The truth wasn't announced by a powerful body, but recorded on a phone, shared by strangers. And it forced a small corner of the world to re-examine itself. Sometimes, the greatest form of protest is standing still. While you're reading this, does this story make you think twice about how we're so quick to judge? If you've ever seen something that's not right, take a moment to speak up, to record, to speak out. And if you believe more stories like this should be told, please share, please subscribe. Because sometimes, all it takes is one captured moment to change the way the world sees justice.